Hello, everyone. This is Stephen Chudy again. Welcome to the 2017 National Foreign Language Resource Center's online symposium on the power of project-based language learning. Today, we have two presentations that I think will interest you greatly. The first presentation is from Lauren Scheller, who is Foreign Language Educators of New Jersey, from Foreign Language Educators of New Jersey. She will be speaking on defining high-quality project-based language learning. Following Lauren, we have a presenter from the University of Oklahoma, Professor Daniela Buscilio, and she will be presenting to you her story of the project that she designed and piloted with her own students called Not So Fast, Exploring Fast Food Influence on Italian Culture Through PBLL. Tomorrow, at the same time, we will offer you two additional presentations. One of those is another example of a designed and delivered project, and the final one gives you some more information on how you can continue to learn more about project-based language learning. So without further ado, remember, you can post questions in the text chat. Please address them to everyone. And I would like to hand off to Lauren Scheller from the Foreign Language Educators of New Jersey to talk to us about defining high-quality project-based language learning. Go ahead, Lauren. Lauren, oh, there you are. I thought you might not have unmuted yourself, but now I can hear you. Go ahead.
Okay, great. Hi, everyone. My name is Lauren Scheller, and like Stephen said, I am from the Foreign Language Educators of New Jersey, which is the teacher professional organization for New Jersey for world languages. In my own journey for PBL, I used PBL in my classroom, and then I coached PBL for other teachers. And currently, I work nationally to help different school systems implement PBL, in all different areas, not just project-based language learning. So through my journey of using PBLL in the classroom to seeing PBL in all subject areas, I've really seen how it's had amazing impact on students and authenticity in the classroom. So I'm so thankful to be here to share what I've learned along the way, and I hope you find it useful. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, sorry, just give me 1 second. Okay, we're in. So like I said, my name is Lauren Scheller, and I'm going to present for the next portion of time about how we can define high quality project-based language learning. So we're going to talk about what it means to be high quality PBL in general, and the difference between project-based language learning, PBLL, and doing projects, and how you can begin to develop some project ideas. So we want to move from just doing projects in class, which are valid learning experiences or activities, to rich PBLL experiences, and then challenge you to come up with your own project idea. So let's begin and contextualize the idea of the definition of PBLL. So thinking about it within the language classroom, and then you'll have specific examples to draw from instead of a hypothetical definition. So here's one example, a travel example. Many of us have had our learners compare cultures, right? Completing such an activity is not a bad way to teach, and it could even be an activity within a project, but it's not necessarily PBLL. So compare students' activity of comparing leisure activities in Japan and the US to the PBLL project, where students will be creating a travel guide for elderly Japanese tourists. They would still be making comparisons, but now they're doing so with a larger purpose and a more engaging end in mind. In the curricula of most courses at most levels, there is a focus on food, health, or fitness at some point for you. Maybe you have even asked students to write a food journal as they learn the names of new foods in the food pyramid, for example. It's a great activity, once again, but to move students to more rigor and inquiry within project-based language learning, you might ask students to create a campaign to promote healthy eating and fitness within their community. And so do you see how approaching it this way would allow for inquiry to be driven by the students? So they start with a question and something that they're going to be doing as the shell for the learning. Here's another example. Students often learn about different countries of their target language. And I've seen many teachers have students research a country and then present it to their class. So once again, a PowerPoint presentation is a great learning activity, but in the case on the left, there's not necessarily an authentic reason for students to know this information other than to present it to their classmates. Whereas you can see the PBLL example has students developing an understanding of a country through this engaging contextualized lens. And then they're able to use their language skills to show how their cultural understanding of this other country is important or useful. In this example, this actually comes from a high school level 2 classroom, and it's based on the textbook that they were using. There's a chapter on technology. So I've seen the activity on the left done by a teacher where students create a Facebook profile for themselves or someone famous in the target language, and they have to learn some of the technology vocabulary in order to do that. Students might even work in groups. They can pull in, a cultural icon, but it's not necessarily deep, meaningful engagement and interaction with the language. So think about how the example on the right with a full PBLL unit would allow students to interact with an authentic community and then use similar language in a way that serves a purpose for native speakers. Now they're still using that technology language, but they're using it in a context that develops their proficiency and is more relevant to the real world with a real audience. Here again, instead of having students developing a menu, which is a skill they may never need in the target language, they can do something like creating a Yelp site or Yelp type site for the community that makes recommendations of where to eat and why. Here's a semi-authentic example of how you could turn the reading of a novel into a PBLL unit. And in PBLL, there's levels of authenticity. So thinking about that past example of you having an open house for the local target language speaking community and helping them through the various technologies that the school uses. This is a semi-authentic where students are given a real task, but it's maybe not actually going to be used for a real purpose, but it's used within the walls of a class. So it's sort of like a simulation. And that can be something that's nice to try when you're first starting out with PBLL and you're not ready to open up your final product yet to a large audience. But you can see how you could bring in with this project authentic audience along the way. Most classes celebrate cultural holidays. That's just part of our curricula. Here's a way to make the experience more into extended inquiry. And of course, Mardi Gras is just one example of a cultural holiday. So having the students with the end goal to plan the cultural celebration, then they have to ask themselves, well, what is Mardi Gras? How is it celebrated? As opposed to you just teaching it to them, contextual, or just having them celebrate it that day, which often happens. Here's another example, having students create an artifact for others to learn from. So in the left side, that's more of a task that you have students do, but if you have a unit about animals or about habitats or life cycles, you can work with a local organization and have students build something that can be for other outside audiences or even younger students within the school. This could be modified to address that audience as well. Okay, so hopefully some of these examples have provided you with some input to think about how you can take different tasks, activities, or projects and sort of turning them upside down and starting with thinking about the end product that the students are going to create, and then thinking about what language you would have to teach in order to get there. Let's look at the difference between just a task or an activity and project-based language learning. So if we look at the top and think about that as a project or activity and compare that to what all those tables are on the right side were the PBLL examples, you might have begun to think about some of the fundamental differences between the two. And maybe in your mind you started to think about, okay, what sort of sequence would that play out as far as my day-to-day lesson planning? So this graphic really digs into what the experience would be like for the students. So on the top image, students are learning content without necessarily a context, without any context. And then they're given a project at the end to show what they've learned. So it's very traditional, right? You begin with some sort of direct input, they do some application, there's a quiz, continue that, there's a review for a final exam, and then at the end, students can do a project. Contrast that with the project-based language learning unit. And so PBLL flips the paradigm and presents the task first that creates the context for learning. And then from there, a teacher creates benchmarks along the way to formatively assess students as they collaboratively work towards their final presentation, the event, or the product, whatever it is that they're creating. Many of the activities in red you've done with students in the past. These are methods you've used, and they're still embedded within a project. You're still using your teacher toolbox. I need to be very clear about that. Project-based language learning provides an authentic, engaging context through which students learn language, but the methods that you use with your students, those are still very applicable. So I repeat, you're still using your teacher toolbox. But with PBL, students begin with the question, that they begin with the task or they begin with the challenge. And then, like I said, all the learning is contextualized and meaningful and authentic. So let's cross the top flow map off and think about an example of a PBLL unit. So in this example, this goes back to the project versus PBLL example about students hosting an open house for community members, families in the community. So the launch would be introducing students to a local target language speakers, either parents or families who may feel disconnected to the school because many of the technologies are not in their in the language that they speak at home. And so then students begin to empathize with that authentic audience and think about what they could do to engage that community. Now, I have to say that when you launch your project, you don't just have a beginning question, but you also provide, you can provide some parameters for the students. So you say, okay, so now that we understand the issues that these parents are experiencing, I'm going to have you develop an open house for these community members or these family members. And so the students understand that that's their target audience, and they understand what their final product is going to be right from the onset. So the students right away begin thinking about how they could help that target audience access the school technologies better, and what they would need to learn in order to be able, and what they would have to be able to do with the language in order to accomplish that task. So right away they're saying, okay, we're going to need to know how to talk about technology. We're going to have to know how to give instructions. And so that is the content that you're teaching your students, but once again, it's within the end product. So then you as the teacher would break down the project into benchmarks, or your benchmarks could actually be your performance assessments. So you check in that students have the knowledge and skills that they need in order to develop that final product. So the first benchmark there, students are able to instruct someone how to use something. And then in the second benchmark, we're saying students can engage in interpersonal dialogue about a technology. Throughout the process, though, students are preparing for the event and developing their ability to collaborate within the target language. There's a bit.ly link that takes you to this resource and other resources on the New Tech Network website. So I'm hoping by now you have a sense of what PBL looks like in a language classroom. So let's define what makes PBL high quality, or I'm sorry, PBL high quality. And then throughout this series, you're going to get more into PBL. But this is we're going to use some BIE resources here. These are non-proprietary resources on the Buck Institute for Education website, so that's BIE.org. Recently, BIE collaboratively developed the concept of gold standard PBL, and these are the design elements when you're designing a project that you want to make sure the project incorporates. In the center, you see that it's like a lens, and the center focuses on the key knowledge, understanding, and success skills that you want that students need to learn by completing the project or the unit. It's important with project-based learning that, and it's unique to project-based learning in some ways, that it's not just about students developing key knowledge and understanding, but there's also an opportunity for them to develop success skills by doing the project and thinking about the lens of language through an authentic audience. If you want to read more about the design elements, and there's plenty of other resources as well, you can go to the link there, or you can just go to BIE.org and explore. And so some of the resources that I'm going to bring up now can also be found on that website. So we have this graphic that explains what the elements are, but there's also a project design rubric that shows the sliding scale or the progression of practice. And so as you're designing your project, you want to think about the right-hand column, but remembering that you're on a PBL journey, and that there might be some projects that you design that have a really high quality, challenging problem or question, but your inquiry might be limited, and as a novice PBL teacher, you're working towards moving to the right side. So if these are the design elements for gold standard PBL, let's think about these within a language context. Like I showed you, the project has to focus on student learning goals. These are standard-based content and skills. This is the success skills that I mentioned, like critical thinking, problem solving, collaboration, self-management. And you know that you can go to your world language readiness standards. You can go to performance descriptors for language learners from ACTFL. You can go to the 5 Cs. All of that is our key knowledge and skills. When you are designing a project, you want to make sure the project has a challenging problem or question. And so the project can be a design challenge. You're asking the students to design something. It can be a thought-provoking question you're asking them to solve. It can be a real-world problem within the community, like the technology night. There was a real meaningful problem that we wanted students to solve, and we want that problem or question to be at the appropriate level of challenge for the level of students. A project has sustained inquiry built in. So students engage in the process of asking questions, finding out answers to those questions, using resources, judging the validity of the resources and the answers that they come up with, and that leads to new questions, and it allows them opportunity to reflect on what they've learned and what they know now and what they still need to know. So a project will begin with presenting the challenging problem or question, and that'll launch the students right into the beginning of their inquiry process, where they say, okay, so I'm beginning to empathize with this authentic audience who's not engaged in the school because we're not able to communicate with them in the language that they speak. Okay, so what are the things what do I need to know about this audience? What technologies do they have access to that they would need help with? And what do I need to know as a learner to be able to communicate with them? And once they learn a certain amount, they can go back to that original the audience that was brought into the classroom and tell them a few things and say, am I on the right track? Is this what you're needing to feel like you're equipped to be more engaged in the school? So that process of sustained inquiry. There has to be a level of authenticity in a project, and authenticity takes many forms. This means the project can feature a real-world context. And so, like I said before, there's sort of a sliding scale of a real-world context. It could be completely authentic or semi-authentic. Also, the tasks and the tools that the students use could be authentic. There could be quality standards to the final product that model the authentic, the tasks that you do in the real world and the sort of quality standards you need to complete a task at a job. There's also this sort of personal authenticity. And so, it could be a project that speaks to students' personal concerns, issues, or even their own identities. And that's a different level of authenticity. A project should always have some sort of voice and choice for the students. So students have opportunities to express voice and choice on some important matters within the project, either the questions that they're going to address, the texts and resources they're going to use, maybe the people that they work with, maybe what their final product would be. Maybe some students want to do a PowerPoint while other students want to do a Prezi, and that's really basic, but providing that voice and choice is authentic for students. maybe the organization of the way they complete tasks can be up to them. You also want students to have opportunities to take significant responsibility and work independently from the teacher when appropriate. And so during that time, they have some voice in the task that they're completing and some choice in the way that they use their time. Project-based learning often builds in reflection throughout the project, and the idea of reflection as learning, was originated from this idea of constructivist learning, and maybe you're familiar with John Dewey, but he was the one that said the real learning occurs when you reflect upon what you have learned. And so you really want to build in reflection opportunities throughout the project. This could take the form of journaling, small group discussions, one-on-one meetings with the instructor, peer groupings. You want students and teachers to engage in thoughtful, comprehensive reflection, and not just at the culmination of the project, but like I said, throughout the project. And these are opportunities to say, okay, what have I learned? And now what do I still need to know? You need to build in opportunities for critique and revision. And this is when students will give and receive and use feedback to improve their final product. So in project-based learning, it's not fair at the end to judge a student's final product, maybe it's a public presentation, using a rubric, unless you've given them opportunities to get feedback on that and practice that final presentation. So it's really about students getting feedback to be able to revise their work and improve it. Throughout the process, students' work is in progress, and it's the peers, the teachers, self-reflection, all of those contribute to revising their final product and their work. There's some aspect of the project that needs to be public. So whether the student work is made public by presenting or offering it somehow to people beyond the classroom, or their students are publicly explaining the reasoning behind choices that they made, explaining the inquiry process that they went through, maybe about how they work together, what they learned through working with others, like maybe they're explaining those success skills. In the health example that was shown earlier, students were designing brochures and other resources for a real audience. And that really raises the stakes for students. It creates more high quality work, and it creates a real deadline that for students will raise the level of engagement and really empower learners. And here too, they're using the language for a real purpose, and they're connecting to real people. And remember, it doesn't always have to be this ribbon cutting ceremony. A product can be virtual as well, and that's also public. A teacher that I worked with had students create YouTube tutorials, how-tos for different, one of the examples was just how to use an ATM machine. And still to this day, students go back to that video and it has tens of thousands of hits. So just posting that publicly, how to use an ATM machine, the Spanish speakers actually Googled that, found the video, and found it useful in the real world. So it was kind of wild for those students and such an engaging experience for them. So let's tying this all together. Key knowledge, understanding, and success skills at the heart of the project, and then all of the design elements that are what make PBL high quality. So one thing that I mentioned in the beginning of this webinar is tasking you with coming up with an idea for your project. And I've threaded some examples throughout the webinar, but now I want you to start thinking about how you could come up with your own idea. So there's different types of projects. Some of the projects that I've shared already are some of the examples here. You've seen students can create or design something, or even plan an event, examine an issue, solve a problem, investigate a historical event, or even explore a philosophical issue or question. Sometimes you want to start with something that is in the news, that a student discusses in class, and you can build a project around. Other projects can be used from year to year and are relevant in a timeless sort of way. For sources of inspiration, you can go to your content standards. So some of the projects, like the health project, for example, came right from the content standards. The project about technology came from the community. Sometimes your students will present things based on their interests, and you can develop that into a project. There's current events. Maybe there's a real world problem. There's also online project libraries. The NFLRC has an online project library that I'm sure will be shared, and there's projects that you can use for inspiration and customize for your learners. You have your file cabinet of activities and tasks and projects that you can develop into full-blown PBLL units. Also think about your colleagues. One of the best things that you can do for yourself as you're embarking on your PBL journey is to find a buddy and bring a buddy along in this process. Even if that buddy doesn't teach the same language that you do, you'll find that bouncing ideas off of that person who's at the same phase that you are will be really useful. And that was one of the best things that I ever did in my own PBL practice. So I would like you to think of a project or an activity that you have done with your students. Maybe it's a real world issue or a problem that can inspire your students, and think about how you can transform that idea into PBLL. You have an understanding about PBLL and what and how that looks different, maybe from a project or a task or activity. Now you have an understanding of what elements a project needs to have and how that project should be meaningful and contextualize the learning for your students. So I hope that maybe you have some ideas swirling around in your head, and that you can begin to try out. Just to go back to the resources that were presented throughout the webinar, I talked about the BIE PBL design rubric, the gold standard elements. There was the graphic from the New Tech Network, and there's also another folder here of lots of materials that we used in a past NFLRC session that I think you'll find still relevant and useful. And I put that toolbox there because I want to remind you, don't forget about your teacher toolbox. Successful foreign language teaching works within PBL. Remember, you're creating the engaging contextualized context for students, but you still are using many of the strategies that you've used before. And finally, please keep in touch. I have my Twitter there, and there is my direct email. If after the Q&A you feel like you still have some questions, I'm really happy to keep in touch and follow you in your PBL journey. And so from there, we'll go to questions.
Thank you very much, Lauren. We have busily had, we've been keeping our eyes on the chat, and there have been a number of questions. I think that Jim Yoshioka may have some ideas about which questions he would like to lead you off with. Oh, okay. Jim is signaling that that I should go ahead with that. I noticed that. Okay. I noticed that there's a strong theme of people being unsure how to reconcile the essential feature of sustained inquiry and authenticity which means, using the language as native speakers use it, even in a professional context, to make an impact in the real world with students who are beginners and don't have functional communicative capacity. How do you make that, authentic project when students can't do that much functionally?
So here's a great example, and I think sometimes it's best to answer that through examples. In my French 1 class, and sometimes you're just bound by the curricula. You have these great projects ideas, but you're really bound by the curricula. And sometimes you find that you can be most creative within certain constraints. So we had this authentic context in our school of Haitian students who came in as emerging bilingual students. English was their second language, and schooling was different. The context of schooling was different, and it was a great opportunity for them to interact with the students in my classroom, because they had this project was done in the beginning of the year. They had very minimal French, but they were still able to make something that was useful for the students. So what they made was a welcome packet and a welcome tour for those students. So they learned to say, here is the gym. Students exercise in the gym. And so they were able to bring the students around the school and show them different things. And so, of course, we broke this script, and there was definitely a little bit of English in there, and that's okay too. But they were able to create a tour of the school, talk about all of the components of the school. They had to learn about what school was like for those students and how it would be different here, in order to learn about, in order to understand what they had to focus on, right? So, you weren't just going to show them everything in a school that was exactly the same, but you wanted to highlight the differences. So we did look at websites for other schools, but that experience was highly scaffolded. So they were able to look at a website from another school in French, and that activity of trying to decode the language of that website could have been a week-long activity, really. And as a teacher, I guided them through different components of that. So I hope that's a helpful example.
Yes, and I think that part of your answer ties into another question that people are asking. If we want to accomplish reflection, right? You were talking about reflecting with the student so that they recognize what they've learned. How is that done in the target language? What is the role of the target language?
So PBLL is amazing for developing all of this extra language that you don't even realize you're having students develop, because there's also the process of PBL. So in addition to the very specific language targets that you have through the content of the project, there's also language that students need to be able to engage in the project itself. And I always recommend at the beginning of the project, after you have your entry event and you share your question or your problem or your challenge, usually with some sort of driving question, you begin with a need to know list. So the students start listing all of the things that they need to know. But there's also a second need to know list that emerges throughout the process. And these are the things that they need to know how to say and do in order to just be able to participate in the project itself. So not necessarily like the technology vocabulary for the night, but to talk to each other and to give feedback to each other and to say something about the work that they've done and the quality of the work. And so you don't need to introduce that vocabulary all at once, but as it comes up and you have some very small reflections in the beginning, and you can start with, I agree with what you're saying. I agree. I like that idea. and then you slowly move to more advanced concepts in the target language. And as the students need that language, you introduce it and you keep it up throughout the classroom. So, maybe you mark it as reflection language. So when it's time for them to stop and reflect, you have some inputs, some sentence starters for them to work with.
So the implication seems to be that in some instances where it's impossible to scaffold things in a short enough time to meet the requirements of the class, that you do use English for some sort of executive functions so that you can clear away that business and get down to that target language that you want to focus on. Would you say that that's a correct characterization?
Yeah, that's a correct characterization. And sometimes it seems like a dirty word or something, but what I can say is that you can quickly clear away misconceptions, and then you can get down to the business of having students use the language and use it in a way that they really feel like they need to be able to say something. So the experiences that they have when they are remaining in the target language are so much more language rich and so much more authentic, and you're using authentic resources and authentic audiences, so it naturally differentiates for students, and you notice at the end that they actually acquired more language than they would have if you would have had discrete language tasks.
Okay, there are two other themes that have shown up that in the 2 remaining minutes in Q&A, I wonder if you can touch on. One of them is, what if the project is presented to a public audience that does not speak the target language? How can, a foreign language project be delivered to an audience that doesn't speak that language? And then the other one is, what if your school has not gone whole hog for PBL rather, and you're supposed to fit project-based learning into the jacket of another curriculum?
So I'm going to address the second question first, and I will say that was me. That was completely me. And I said earlier, find a buddy. If you can find a buddy, you'll be saving yourself so much isolation and struggle, and you'll be so much more productive with your time. You can co-plan. Often, even at the same level, the learning goals are the same for different languages. So you can even co-design a project together. And I said before, like, the constraints can often lead you to the most creative projects. In my classroom, I had students. The YouTube that I explained was for my buddy teacher. I also had students do YouTube videos, and that was directly from a chapter that I had to cover in a certain amount of time. And it was using the technology vocabulary, and it was using commands. And literally those things were both in the same chapter. And I said to myself, okay, how can I come up with a project that has students using commands, and that has technology vocabulary, and has them understanding something about, I think in this case it was actually France, like the way that teens use technology. And those were the 3 things in the unit. And that was the project that we came up with to post a YouTube video about using a certain technology. I think that can often be, designing your first project can be helpful, because you don't have all of the options available. You're sort of constrained to melding a couple of things within one unit. And then the other question was about presenting a product to speakers who don't speak the language that you speak.
Correct.
Can you just clarify that? Okay.
So let's say students have made some kind of artistic product, or they designed something that's in the target language, but they can't reach an audience, or they have no way to present publicly to that target language audience. Have you had instances where students present more about what they did versus actually you know, the technology night example that you cited, that is a target language speaking audience that has a need for that information. They need to learn how to use that technology. But there might be other cases where that it's sort of not like that.
Right. So I think the other example that I just cited, where you post something online to a potential audience, is a way that that you can do it. There's also levels of authenticity, like I talked about in a project. We really want the students to interact with an authentic audience as much as possible, but with given certain content and time constraints that you have, and if you're just starting out, you may want to do something that's less authentic, where it's sort of a simulation. I think the other thing is you can think of this as an opportunity to teach some of the language to another audience who doesn't speak the language. So sometimes you'll have projects where students actually present to, if they're intermediate learners, they can present to more novice learners in a teaching capacity.
Great. Thanks for those two ideas.